Hello everybody, welcome to this little demo video on Rook Endgames. This is FIDE Master Arne Jochens speaking, and I am planning to offer a course on Rook Endgames, which will be quite comprehensive and will be progressively built up. And in this video I'll pick out some positions to give you a glimpse of what you can expect from that course. Of course, the course itself will be interactive, which means that you can ask questions during the lessons, and this I cannot do in this recorded video, but I will try to pause at certain points or to tell you to pause the video at certain points so that you can think about the positions for yourselves, because obviously by only listening you won't learn nearly as much as by thinking for yourselves. So I've picked out some positions that will be discussed in much more detail in the course, but to still have a common thread here in this little video, I decided to focus on one particularly important principle that is known as the Taj Rule. And you've probably all heard this at one point in your chess career or another, and it is most often stated in the concise form, rooks belong behind passed pawns. But let us look at the original formulation to get a better feel for what Tarrasch had in mind by this rule. He wrote in his book The Game of Chess in 1931, and I'm translating from German here, "In complicated rook endings, the most important theorem is the one laid down by the author. The rooks belong behind the passed pawns, behind the hostile ones to impede them, behind one's own to support their advance. This favorable position of the rook is often decisive." And Tarrasch then goes on to give an example or two where he illustrates this rule. And the examples he gives are quite similar to the position I have set up here. So we have pawns on one side of the board and one extra pawn on the other side. And in these positions the rule is particularly important, but it does also apply to many other positions, as we will see. This is actually a position from a famous game, Botvinnik against Boleslavsky, played in the USSR Championship in 1941. And here, maybe you want to think about the position for yourselves and pause the video at this point and decide what white to move should play here. Okay, so in the game, Botvinnik made the right choice by playing rook to b1, which was not too difficult, of course, after my introduction about the Tarrasch rule, because this is a case in point. The rook belongs behind the passed pawn. On b1, the rook is excellently placed because it can support the advance of the pawn wherever the pawn goes. It will always be supported by the rook. And, which is also very important, the rook prevents the black rook from coming behind the pawn. Because remember, the Tarrasch rule is not only a rule about the rook supporting its own pawn, but also about the other rook, which wants to impede the advance of this pawn. So for example, if in the position we started from, white had made any other move. Of course, he cannot move the rook away from the back rank at the moment because he does not want to get mated. So let's say if he plays h3, then black can follow the Tarrasch rule and place his rook behind the passed pawn. And this is also an excellent post for black's rook, because not only does the rook attack the pawn, so white would have to defend from the side in this case, but now the pawn cannot advance, because black's rook controls not only b4 but b5 as well. And also the rook here attacks the g2 pawn and impedes the white king. So this is clearly the best place for black's rook as well. And that's why white has to play rook b1 precisely at this moment, to prevent rook b2. And now maybe at this point you want to again pause the video and think about what black should do now. I think that the position is already winning for white, but black should try to put up as much resistance as possible. And there is one way that would offer the most resistance or the best chances here for black. So you may want to think about this, what black should play. And the answer is that he should have tried rook to c6. And this is another important rule in rook endgames. Quite often when you have to blockade a passed pawn, you should do so as early as possible. Black does not want the white pawn to move any further than b5 here. Ideally he would like to put his rook on b5, but he cannot achieve this anymore, so he puts the rook on b6. After b5, rook to b6. And then black can activate his king. As I said, the position is probably already winning for white, but his task would not be so easy here. Instead, in the game after rook b1, Boleslavsky played king to f7, allowing the pawn to advance to b6 at least, and this makes it easier for white, as we will see. After king e6, b6, now clearly black has to blockade. This is his last chance. White is already threatening to play b7, and then the pawn could not be stopped anymore. So rook c8 is forced now. And now white must be a little careful. If he pushes the pawn too far, like this, b7, this would be a mistake, because black can of course blockade, and now black has time to win the pawn. Of course white activates his king, because when black captures on b7, white may want to exchange rooks, and in the pawn endgame, as well as in the rook endgame, king activity is very important. So black plays king to d6, white activates his own king, but now black can in fact offer the transition to a pawn ending and just take the pawn, because the white king is not advanced far enough. If white exchanges rooks and tries to bring up his king to attack the black pawns, black is just in time to keep him out. Black is covering e6 with his king, and so the white king cannot advance, and the game should end in a draw. So in this position b7 would be a mistake. And that's why white has to start activating his king now, and he played h3. He could also play king g1, but this is just as fast if we assume that the king wants to come to f4, for example. Playing king g1, king f2, king f3, king f4 takes 4 moves, as does h3, king h2, king g3, king f4. So he plays h3, and now black plays rook to b8, king h2, king to d5, and white plays king to g3. Now black tries an important defensive technique, which does not save the game in this case, but it is good to know this idea. Black changes the guards. He does not want to blockade the pawn with his rook any longer, because this makes the rook very passive. This is of course also one of the reasons behind the Taj Rule. By placing his own rook behind the passed pawn, white has forced the black rook in front of the passed pawn, and this is often a bad place for the defending rook because it is so passive there. And so so black wants to blockade the pawn with his king instead, because then he will be able to activate his rook, and this offers the best chances. So he plays king to c6, white activates his own king, king to b7, and now at least the black rook is free to move. And at this point you may again want to think about what white should do now. So you may want to pause the video and think about how white can improve his position at this point. And Botvinnik showed an excellent understanding of the position at this point. Because, as we will also see in further examples, the Taj Rule of placing the rook behind the pawn is only a rule of thumb, as practically any rule in chess is. You have to take concrete aspects of every position into account, and sometimes the rook does not belong behind the passed pawn, or no longer does, as is the case here. The best move is rook to e1. The rook has done its duty behind the pawn on b1, but now that black has blockaded the pawn with his king, the rook will be better placed on e6, defending the pawn from the side, because there it will at the same time influence events on the king's side, as we will see. And rook e1 is justified tactically because black cannot take on b6, as then white would just play rook to b1, and this time the pawn endgame is winning for white, because he can exchange rooks and then just play king to f5 and attack the black pawns. So, on the other hand, white is now already threatening to play rook to e7, capturing these pawns with his rook. So black had to try rook g8, defending g7, and now rook to e6 defends b6 again, and the rook is excellently placed. So here we have the first exception from the Taj Rule. Sometimes, in particular in cases like this where the king is blockading the passed pawn, the rook may want to defend the pawn from the side, because then it can be even more active in certain circumstances. And now white just wins by advancing on the king's side and attacking, or rather exchanging one of the kingside pawns and then attacking the other one with king and rook, and thus winning it. So let me just show you the remaining moves quickly here. Black played king a6, king g5, king b7, h4, king a6, h5, king b7, g4, king a6, king h4, king b7, and now comes h6. Normally when you are playing for a win you would try to avoid pawn exchanges, but here white has to make inroads for his king, so he has to allow one pair of pawns to be exchanged, because now he can attack h7. Black defends, but now the white king also approaches, comes to h6, or rather now white can even play rook c7 immediately here. The pawn endgame would of course be winning for white, because he can capture on h7 and then promote his g-pawn. So black tried rook e5 check, g5 captured on b6, but now white is easily winning because the black king is too far away. And the game ended like this. And here white has reached the so-called Luthena position, or Luthena as the English may pronounce it. You probably know this already, but if you do not, the position with the pawn on the 7th rank and the king in front of it is always winning, because white can employ a technique that is called building a bridge. He brings his rook to the 4th rank, and then the rook can shield the king. At this point Boleslavsky resigned, because if he tries to check, then eventually the white rook will shield the white king. And that's the reason why this position here with the king in front of the pawn is always winning. Okay, but let us go back to one point in the game where black decided to employ this defensive technique that I talked about of changing the guards, of bringing the king to b7 to free the rook. We should also have a look at what happens if black decides to stay on the king side with his king and just wait passively. For example, if he plays king f5, then white can even push the pawn to b7 because now his king is already on h2. And if black waits on the king side, then he will be slowly pushed back by rook b4, check here, king f5, king g3. White can activate his own king, and at the same time the rook can check or take squares away from black's king. And here we can again see why the Taj Rule often does apply. The white rook is excellently placed behind the pawn here, because it not only supports the pawn but also can check the black king and drive the black king back. And the black rook is very badly placed because it cannot even move. And this will become important, for example, if after king f6, king f4, king e6, check, king f7, king e5, king e7, king d5, king d7. For example, if we reach a position like this, then white can just make a waiting move with his rook, and black is in Zugzwang. He has to move his king. Sooner or later he can still move some pawns, but these pawn moves will soon run out. Then black has to move his king, and so the white king can either come to the king side, capturing these pawns, or it can come to c6, supporting the b pawn, and then the white rook is free and white will also win. So this example clearly shows how strong a rook behind a passed pawn can be. But we also saw later in the game that sometimes the rook does not or no longer belong behind the passed pawn. And the next game is another exception from the Taj Rule. This is from a game Yusupov against Timman, and white is to move here. And Yusupov, probably without thinking too long, played rook to a1, following the Taj Rule and seemingly bringing the rook to a good position. But the problem was that after rook to a5, blockading the pawn as early as possible, white really had no way to make any further progress here. He played king e3, trying to activate his king, but black has e5, and now the black king will also be very active. And if white tries to support the pawn with the passed pawn on a4 with his king, then black will counterattack with his king on the king side, because the pawn on g3 is or can be weak in these cases. And the game progressed king e4, black exchanges, but now black just waits and white did not make any progress. Black exchanges one more pair of pawns. And now you can see that white has decided to bring his rook to the side of the pawn, but the black king is already too active. So the rook goes back behind the pawn, but white does not make any progress. And the game ended in a draw later, like this. But in fact, in the position we started from, white could have played rook to e4 instead, and this would give him quite an easy win. The main point being that black can now not activate his king. If black ever plays king f5, white can always reply rook to e5 check, and then put the pawn on a5. And if the black king goes to g4, of course the white rook can even come to g5, where it will be very well placed, defending g3 and attacking g6 and supporting a5 all at the same time. So the black king cannot be activated. The white rook is not only supporting the a pawn, but protecting the king side at the same time. And this means that now in this position the white king is free and can just go to b4 to support the a pawn. And there's nothing black can do here. So white would have a simple win. So the lesson here is that the Taj Rule does apply in many positions. Often the best place for the rook is behind the passed pawn, but not always. You must not blindly follow any rules in chess in general, but you always have to look at the position concretely, do some calculations, and try to appreciate the most important features in the concrete given position in front of you. Let us look at a more technical example. You probably know that in positions like this, where the defending king is already on the promotion square and the pawn is on the 5th rank, the most common or the easiest way to defend is the so-called Philidor method, which consists in putting the rook on the 6th rank and then just waiting on the 6th rank until white pushes the pawn, and whenever white pushes the pawn to e6, then the rook can come behind and just give checks from behind, because then the white king will not be able to find shelter anywhere. But in the given position, with black to move, there is no way to reach the Philidor defense, because the white pawn is controlling f6, and if black tries maybe rook g5 to come to g6, then this is already too late, because white can play king to d6. Let's see this, he can play king e6, and now black cannot reach the Philidor position anymore. If he checks, the pawn can advance, and white is already threatening rook h8 checkmate. So here it would be too late. But there is another defensive method, and in fact black can still draw in the position we started from by bringing the rook back immediately. And now maybe the most practical winning try for white is king to d6. Because here there are many ways for black to go wrong. Only one move to draw now. Maybe you want to think about this if you don't know the position. It's quite hard to figure it out, I think, but nevertheless it would be a good exercise to think about this and try to figure out what black should play here to defend himself. Maybe you want to pause the video at this point. Okay, so in this position we could say that the Taj Rule does apply, because the best and in fact the only move here is rook to e1. White must immediately put his rook behind the pawn to prevent its advance. And the reason will become clear if we look at some variations here. Maybe you have tried the tempting move rook to d1 check, playing as if it were a Philidor position, but this is wrong here, because now the white king can hide on e6, threatening rook to h8 checkmate. So the black king has to run. And another rule that we will talk about in detail in the Rook Endgame course is that in such situations it is usually the best try to go to the short side of the pawn. If you think about the e-pawn as dividing the board in two halves or in two parts, one longer part on the queen side in this case and one shorter part on the king side in this case, then when you have to move away from the promotion square with your king, you should usually go to the short side, because this may in some circumstances allow your rook to give checks from the long side. And when you give checks like this, it is often important to be as far away from the king as possible, so that the king cannot attack your rook. But here king to f8 is not enough, because white can check and then come to a7 to prevent these checks from the long side that I have just indicated. And again threatening checkmate, and now the king can be driven to g7 and white can advance the pawn. And he controls the a file, so white could only be checked from the b file, but this is not far away from the king. Not far enough to make a draw. I will not go into more detail here at this point, but you can check this out for yourselves. So rook to d1 check in fact loses, and the same is true of rook a1. This is also a tempting move, I would say, because as we just saw, in some cases it is crucial to control the a file, but here white can check and the pawn can immediately advance with check. And the problem is that even if black attacks the rook, the pawn can just advance even further. And black can only reach an endgame with rook against queen, but white is winning there. And finally, if the black rook just stays on f1, maybe to prevent the line we just saw, where white gives a check on f7. So if black just waits, with the king, by playing king to f8, then white can also win by just driving the king away and again taking control of the a file. And white will reach a Luthena position. Again, the black rook is not far away from the king, not far enough from the king to make a draw here with checks from the side. But why does rook e1 in fact draw the game? The reason is that if white now tries to advance the pawn, if he advances the pawn immediately, then we have in fact transposed to the Philidor defensive method, and black can just check, and the white king has no shelter. So first white would have to try to drive the black king away. He can do so by playing king to e6, but now the king can come to the short side again. And the main point is that now, if white tries to advance the pawn, he can check once again and put the rook on the a file. But black will just wait. And if white tries to advance the pawn, then black can play king to f7, controlling e6. So the pawn cannot advance. There is one dangerous try left for white, which is to play rook to e8 at some point. Let's say after king f8, rook h8 check, king g7, rook to e8. This is the most dangerous try, and this is again an exception from the Taj Rule, because in this case the white rook is well placed in front of the pawn, because it is the only way here for the white rook to support the advance of the pawn. but still it is not enough in this position because black can wait. And if white tries to make progress here, then I'm not sure if this is now the only move, but we could also check first. But the main point is that at some point we can now come to the A file and give checks from the side. And this time there's enough distance. There are 3 files in between the black rook and the pawn, and this is enough for black to make a draw by giving checks from the side. In fact, I think we should do this immediately here. Play rook a2 immediately. Okay, so in this position it is important to just know this fact, I think, that black should play rook to e1. And this is known as the Kling and Horwitz defense, sometimes also called the Lasker defense or the second Philidor method. But the point is that the rook must come to e1 at this point. The only way to draw here is to place the rook behind the pawn to control its advance. Let us look at a practical example that illustrates this a bit more. This is from a correspondence game played in the Correspondence Olympiad somewhere between 1995 and 1998. And here it is white to move. And maybe you want again to think about this position for yourselves a bit. Try to figure out what white should play at this point. In fact, in the game he made a crucial mistake here. But first let us see what white should have played. He should have just played king to d7 to advance the pawn. This cannot be prevented, and we will basically reach a Luthena position soon. The pawn on a5 is not very relevant here because it is not far advanced. This would be quite a simple win for white. For example, if black tries... Okay, black has one good try. After rook to a1, the win is not so simple. White pushes d6, of course, but now black can also push his own pawn. And now white must be a little careful. At this point he still has several moves, I think, but let's say he plays rook to b4. Black advances. White can drive the black king away, although this is not strictly necessary. But now white must play precisely. And we have already seen some examples of this. This is again an exception from the Taj Rule. Rook to a4 would not be enough to win here, as we will see in the main game, or in the game continuation. But white can win by attacking the pawn from the side. The point is that white is attacking the pawn, and thus he is immobilizing the black rook, and at the same time he is controlling the f-file and thus preventing the black king from approaching the d-pawn. Of course the pawn can advance, but then white can play rook to f2. And now the pawn cannot advance any further. The pawn is attacked, so black cannot move his rook, and black cannot move his king. So here white can make progress, although this may not be so obvious if black just waits with his king. Maybe you want to think about this again. How can white now improve his position? What should white play here? And the point of placing the rook beside the a-pawn in this case is that now white can play rook to c2, still attacking the pawn, so the black rook can still not move. But now the white king has shelter on the c-file. And now if black waits, or now black can of course come back to the f-file, but this is not enough. White can play king to c7 and advance his pawn. For example, king to e6, d7, and at some point black will have to try to activate his rook, threatening to take on d7 with check, but white can give a check himself and then take on a2, and again white will reach a basic winning Luthena position. So king to d7 would be a win for white. But in the game white followed the Taj Rule by playing rook to e8. And it's true that the rook is not badly placed here, but this move loses an important tempo. And now black can draw the game. And maybe you want to again think about this. How should black play now? He has one precise way to draw the game. And if you remember the previous position, maybe you were able to see that now black can apply the same defensive technique. He can play rook to d4. He's essentially playing the Kling and Horwitz defense and just ignoring the fact that there is still an a-pawn on the board. And in fact the pawn disappeared now because white took on a5. But now we have the same draw that we saw in the previous position. Black plays rook to e8 and here a draw was agreed. Again, if white tries to drive the black king away, the point is that even if white tries rook to d8 to advance the pawn, black can give checks from the side. And although in this case there are only two files between the rook and the pawn, this is enough to draw here. Because there's one tactical point after king to b6, black can play king to e7, also attacking the white rook. And this is the reason why white cannot make progress here. So what this example shows is that, as in the Yusupov-Timman game, you should not follow this Taj Rule blindly. There are many exceptions and you must always analyze the position concretely to determine the best move. And in this case rook a8 was a mistake that allowed black to draw the game, while white could have won with king to d7 instead. Let me show you one final example, which also comes from a game and also contains a mistake. This is from a game Anand against Vallejo, played in Linares in 2005. Black was to move in this position and he played the logical move e3. White played king to d1. Basically white is already in Zugzwang here. He has to move something, he cannot move his rook. So we could say that up to this point the Taj Rule did apply in this game. The black rook is excellently placed behind the pawn because now the white rook is very passively placed in front of the pawn. White cannot move the rook because black would take on h7 and win with the b pawn. So white has to move his king. But this would have allowed black to win by making use of a very instructive maneuver here. So you may again want to think about this. Pause the video and figure out what black should play here to win the game. Okay, first of all let me show you what happened in the game. Black played king to b1, but this allowed an immediate draw. because now white can sacrifice his h-pawn to capture the remaining black pawns. He just played rook to b8, threatening h8 queen, so black has to take, and a draw was agreed, because white could now just take on b3, check, and then take on e3. But in this position, black did have a way to win the game, as I said. Here we have again, much as in the first example that I showed you in this video, Botvinnik-Boleslavsky, we have a case where the Taj Rule did apply up to a point, up to this point in fact, but now black should change the position of his rook. And he can use the fact that he can play rook to d2 check to do so. He checks the white king, thus giving white no time to activate his rook, and now he brings the rook to d7. Much as in the one line that we saw in the previous example. The rook is now better placed attacking the pawn from the side, because from there it not only controls the pawn, thus still immobilizing the white rook, but at the same time it can provide shelter to the black king, and this is decisive. For example, white, for the moment white should just wait, but then black can play rook to a7 to be able to move his king to the a file without allowing the black rook a check on a8. And this is decisive because black can now promote his b pawn. For example, if white takes on e3, black just plays king to a2, and the white king can try to approach the pawn, but black just plays b2, threatening to promote, so at this point white would have to give up his h-pawn, threatening h8 queen, so black takes, and now even though white can check, black reaches the basic winning Luthena position again. Okay, that's all for this little demonstration video. I hope you liked the examples I showed you. Again, in the actual course on Rook Endgames, of course I will go into much more detail about not only these positions but many others as well, and I will build up the course progressively. So I will even start by explaining the Luthena and the Philidor positions again, although most of you probably already know them. Yeah, hope you liked this little demo video, and I hope to see some of you in the actual course. Thanks and goodbye.